Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Lacy Brooks Pack, Shame on the Moon, Part 2, by Micheal Lockhart. Mr. Campbell, things are still crazy with the ice storms and power outages. I can't spare anyone else, but I'll come by myself after dark, Sheriff Gene Cloud assured the newest resident and potential voter in his bailiwick. I'll have to remain on call, but I'll base myself here and return as often as I can. We had some trouble almost 2 years ago with an escaped tiger. There may be another, of course. It could also be a people problem. Cattle thievery is not unknown in these parts. No way, Sheriff. No person could have torn up those guns like that. At least not that fast. And I know it sounds crazy, but we seen something. I don't know what, but it was big and had pointy ears. Those howls. Harry's voice trailed off as his mind returned to the terrifying moment during which he and his family had suffered the night previous. He soon regained his focus. My son's wrist is sprained and we're both bruised. I have a creak in my neck and I can't turn my head this morning. Those things came after us when Dalton fired at the big one. I've heard stories in town about weird things out in these woods. The howling. He tried to rephrase what he'd intended to say when he was interrupted by a yowl. Help! 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 Both men, hearts racing, turned towards the area near the hog pen. Perched on the top rail of the fence was a large peacock. It tried to look innocent. Harry shook his head and immediately regretted it as he winced in pain at the motion and pawed at his neck. You should get into the city and get that neck checked out, sir. Those kind of injuries can be pretty serious. If you want, I can have our local EMS come by and check you. Fine bunch of folk. Jean tried another angle of distraction before Harry could resume his point about the howls. Say, maybe it was those peacocks yelling last night. They can make some crazy sounds. Harry's expression turned sour. We haven't had them long. My wife's idea. I can't get used to those cries, he shuddered. But the howls and growls, they were different. Savage somehow and full of warning. People round here cautioned us not to settle so close to the timber company land, but the price was just too good and the timing, well, we wanted the kids out of the city. I'm sure you know things are falling apart in cities all over the place. Jean nodded. Well, in any case, I'll be back here after dark, provided I don't have a call to check. Worst case, I'll send Sergeant Knox. He's top-notch and helped out with the cattle problem last time. He's off tonight, but as my resident expert, I'm sure he wouldn't mind. He'd love to take pictures of the peacocks to show his wife and little one. Great. The uncanny monster pack is on the prowl close to civilization. Gene groused to himself on the way back to his headquarters. Not their fault. The Campbells encroached on their territory. Not the Campbells' fault either, just folks trying to make it in the world and wanting to do right by their children. Maybe they can come to terms. That evening, he made the return journey. He hadn't had much rest, but none of the county emergency services had. He was in the emergency coordinator, but there wasn't much to coordinate. Most residents of the mostly rural county had good sense to lay in supplies and hunker down until the storm passed. They'd had to rescue a few elders who lived alone and several knuckle-draggers who had never heard of monitoring the weather or news. Still, the impact had been mostly one of major discomfort, and likely some of the agricultural damage that would not come to full light until spring. He turned into the dirt lane that led to the Campbells' barn-dominium farmhouse. He admired the initial efforts that Harry and Linda had made to improve the property. Crap, he uttered in surprise. Had that been an upright silhouette out in the trees? Maybe an overwrought imagination punctuated by surrealistic experiences. There was nothing to see when he stopped and shone his alley light around the verge that pressed near the track. He followed the circle driveway and aimed the SUV cruiser back towards the track and town to be ready for action. The Campbells were happy to see him, and Linda treated him to some hot cocoa. Harry and Danny went into town today, but there were no guns or ammo to be had. We're all pretty shook up, Sheriff, but I hope you don't think we're out-of-town weirdos. Jean grinned. You'd have to go some to beat the local weirdos. I've been thinking that maybe you had moved in too close to one of those illegal operations that sometimes settle under the cover of the trees. We haven't had any problems like that on this side of the county for a while, but they tend to come and go. He didn't tell her the reason no crooks used this patch of woods was that they were haunted by genuine monsters. Nothing like a dog-man pack to scare off people on drugs and subject to hallucinations. They discussed some crime prevention tips, and Jean encouraged them to review where their lights focused, maybe install a camera or two. Harry ruefully smiled. Couldn't get guns or ammo, but we found a couple of game trail cameras on sale. I put one up near the front door where our visitors passed last night, and another out the side where the pens are. Couldn't cover 'em all, but if anything runs out in front of the lens, we'll be able to see it and have proof. Sheriff Cloud nodded in approval and prepared to resume his duties. Well, I'm fortified. Thank you, Ms. Linda. I'm going on the prowler watch. Definitely the sheriff, Oscar confirmed with the others. I'd know his scent anywhere. He probably came himself because he suspected it was us. Earl Wolf grunted in agreement. I hate to put him in a bad spot. He would look ineffective if he didn't stop our shenanigans. Lacy had liked Sheriff Cloud, but she wasn't as quick to cede their territory to Two Legs. Others will surely soon follow these first. Soon we'll lose the whole corner to the Two Legs. Their animals will supplicate the prey we hunt, and their stench will drive father to distraction. Earl Wolf shivered. Even these few do. Jean was a close friend, yet I feel inclined to rip into him, even more so than the strangers. Part of the werewolf nature, I suppose. Kill those closest to us. He studied the ground for a moment. Still, I'd like to meet Jean for a moment. Not sure I can communicate, but I need to know that I can draw near him without losing my mind to my instincts. He looked around. We'll have to go. If I scream and leap, you'll have to protect him and stop me, then remove me until I can regain control. Soon after, Jean Cloud was startled when a shadow crossed the back glass of his patrol unit, and the driver's side mirror was occluded by a dark figure that loomed in the darkness. He scrambled for his sidearm, but stopped when he realized it was Oscar. Dang, buddy, you scared the crap out of me. You by yourself? He remembered to ask yes or no questions, normally anathema to law enforcement types. Oscar shook his head and flicked his chin the other side of the SUV. Jean's fear response was intense, more so than it should have been, considering that standing outside his passenger door was one of his closest friends, Earl Brooke. Earl Wolf, he realized. He fought down the goosebumps that had arisen and forced his breathing to slow. And with his heart rate, his window was already down, and he caught a whiff of the monster's musky scent. Hey, Earl, you doing okay? Got those cravings under control? Earl Wolf gape-grinned and then huffed 4 breaths into Jean's face. Jean gasped a little and barely avoided a shudder at the stench of internal carnivore that belched forth. Earl had already been a big man. His werewolf self was equally large and fearsome. Those teeth! They'd chomp me to pieces before my pistol cleared the holster, he apprehended, in wonder that each passing moment his terror receded until he was left with only nervous caution. His calm seemed to assist Earl Wolf to maintain his own posture of friendliness, tinged with a rending of instinct. For the moment it looked as though friendship had won. "So it was you and the pack?" Earl Wolf nodded, then shrugged. It was amazing how much a being could communicate with such limited gestures. Jean knew that, yes, the pack was responsible for the depredation at the Campbell farm, and that it was just part of the natural, unnatural world of this forest. Jean smiled, careful to avoid displaying any teeth. "I know they moved onto your land, long abandoned. It was always private land, though, never part of the timber company tracts. Just saying. There won't be a bunch of others, just his lonely farm." He felt another presence and turned back to where Oscar had stood. Lacy had assumed his place. She gaped a friendly smile, nodded, huffed nausea-inducing breath into his face. She pointed at herself, circled a finger in the air, and then pointed off into the woods of her territory. Sheriff Cloud sighed, as much as to clear his sinuses as in relief. "Thank you, ma'am," he smiled. "They seem like decent enough sort for city folk. Could have been much worse. I heard that some dope manufacturers came running from the forest last year, left behind all their stuff in their shack, told some wild stories, definitely induced by them sampling their own wares. Or so I assured the local press. They won't be back, and—" He looked around and checked to ensure that his body camera was not recording. It wouldn't have hurt any feelings if they had just disappeared. Lacy nodded, then flicked her chin at Earl Wolf. Jean understood immediately that it would have been too much temptation for Earl Wolf to resist, and he would have become a cannibal. Kind of. Maybe. When he looked back towards Earl Wolf, he saw that the werewolf had stepped back, and a pair of shorter, more slender figures had replaced him. They grinned and huffed their fetid breath into his vehicle. "Earl, too, and Adele. You two are massive these days. So good to see you. Impressive scars, too." Jean wasn't versed in what might flatter dogmen, but he knew adolescents. He had a pair of his own at home. Call them tough and competent and large enough to compete with adults, and you had them. Unless, of course, you were their parents. He looked back towards Lacy, but she was gone. He glanced back in the other direction, and sure enough, so were the rest. He'd never comprehended just how such large beings moved so silently and swiftly. He had to leave a little while later. The next county had issued a silver alert for a missing elder couple from over near White Sands Lake, in the old but nice district near the bridge. He wasn't worried for the Campbells anymore. He couldn't tell them, but they would no longer be bothered by monsters from the dark. At least not his monsters. "It was good to see Jean," Earl Wolf announced when the pack stopped for a rest break. "Even better to avoid eating him," he laughed. Lacy agreed. "We'll hunt further west for a while, closer to Alpha Peter's pack. They won't mind. They may even enjoy some company for a pig hunt. Big sounders closer to the lake. More creeks with big fish, too. Maybe they'd allow us to visit the lake. Earl, too, and Adele have never seen it. Oscar and I haven't been there since we first started running together. That's when we met the Petes. Pete was getting old at the time. He was first generation, and his mate was second. Their pups were near grown, and the daughter had made the next territory south. The son was still looking. Tall dogman, lean and smart, friendly type. She glanced at Adele, whose ears had quietly swiveled and twitched involuntarily to hear about the young dogman with a mind. That night, having nothing better to do but hunt as they ranged, they began to steer westward towards the setting sun, something they seemed to chase every night. Food was plentiful enough, and they all enjoyed the deep wilderness, far from human presence. not only for Earl Wolf's sake, but because it was their natural environment. Except when they hunted, they rarely stood on their hind legs. Were anyone to see them pass in the dark, he would think they were a pack of very large hounds or wolves, and assume that they appeared so big because of a trick of the light, or whatever other psychological trick he had to play on himself to convince his poor mind that he had not seen oddly proportioned and jointed creatures stalking the deep woods on a moonlit night. Fortunately, there was little chance that they would encounter the fictional human. One late evening, the sun newly down, Earl Wolf, who was on a point scout, stopped nose raised as he rose to his full height. The pack backed off a little way and gathered for his report. Skunk ape. Not like the Googway, face-eater, just a regular one. It hasn't sprayed today, but the scent is always on them. Maybe we could ask about Pete's pack. Lacy and the rest agreed. They sent Adele to attempt contact. She possessed the slightest, least threatening form and mannerisms. If the skunk ape turned out to possess a nasty disposition, she was plenty fierce and competent enough to shred it. At first the creature tried to quietly elude the pack, as it so often avoided company of any kind outside of mating season. Yet soon it found itself encompassed with the smell of the dog folk. Adele approached slowly and kept her teeth as covered as she was able in order to present no threat to the thickly muscled entity. It sat very still, blending well with its surroundings. "We wish no quarrel," Adele indicated with gestures. "We seek others of our kind." The squat creature before her regarded her suspiciously. "All gone. I leave too." "Where?" she inquired. "Plays of pain and hiding. The bad ones with dead eyes take them. I go now. Leave me in peace." With that, the skunk ape waddled past her and disappeared along the back trail of the dog folk had left. The pack gathered further west of the lingering mild stench of the skunk ape. Adele reported. It said it was leaving and that all the others had been taken by bad ones. It was hard to understand, but the gesture it made, I think it meant dead eyes. I have no idea what sort of beings they were. Lacy patted her daughter on the back and scratched her a little in reward. "You did well. We have an instinct for speech among our own kind, and we first generation understand two-leg speech after a short time. But it is limited with other creatures. It was clearly fearful and released its spray recently enough, judging by the smell. Something haunts these woods. It's where we need to be. We must stay together and move cautiously until we discover the cause for this fear." She gape-grinned. "Then we can show the beings true cause for fear." They eventually reached the shores of the lake, and on the way found nothing but plentiful game and fish. There were no other hunters present. Adele and Earl, too, enjoyed a swim in the freezing cold waters where the wide creek emptied into the broader waters. They each emerged with 2 large fat drum fish, one in each paw. Earl Wolf smiled. He'd grown up calling them Gaspergoo. He wasn't sure he could still say that name. Hard G's were difficult in a wolf's maw. He stared into the waters and awaited his own chance. It came, and he sprang and soon emerged with a large channel catfish that had emerged from the creek. The creek was named for a local tribe that no longer lived in the area. He wasn't sure they ever had. History in these parts had been sketchy at best and covered by the waters and waves of White Sands Lake since the late 1960s. He recalled visiting the dam with his father when he was a little boy. He'd seen his first alligator gar floating dead at the base of the structure that to his young eyes looked so imposing. The pack shared the fish among one another and decided to look for a place to den up for the day. There were human homes nearby and boat docks. The place smelled strongly of 2 legs and thus danger in many forms. They followed the creek back eastward into a swamp, now cold and dead with the recent freeze. Eventually they found a hummock, and after removing their cottonmouth that had taken up residence, they found soft places on which to lie. Instead of shade, they sought spaces where the sun would find them soonest and remain on them longest. Adele had midday watch. It was warm, and she was happy about it. She enjoyed most of the smells around the lake. It had looked intriguing in the moonlight. Lumps and forms of long-dead trees that still lingered in the dead places and often floated to the top to create a hazard for boaters and fishhooks. The lake bed was covered in the matted death of a decades-gone forest. Yet Grandfather had assured them that the dead vegetation created a place from which new life sprang. That excited her. She wondered what had happened to Peter's pack, if the young male was still with them, and whether she would like him. If so, she would move to his territory, maybe even here by the big waters. Her pleasant thoughts were interrupted by Grandpa Wolf waking for his turn. She wasn't tired. "Grandpa, I want to take a quick scout around to see if there are any tracks of others. I like the waters all around. They're too cold right now, but they are full of food." Grandpa grinned and nodded. "Be cautious, my sweet, and return soon. You'll want a nap before we roam tonight." He kissed her forehead in canid fashion, and she grinned up at him briefly, then loped away into the brush. Earl Wolf was deep into his own thoughts when Lacy approached him to take her turn at watch. She looked around to inspect each member of the pack. "Where's Adele?" she asked, not yet concerned. Earl Wolf glanced at the position of the sun. "She went on a little romp and claimed she wanted to scout." Youthful exuberance. "Still, she should be back by now. I expected her before your watch." Lacy, concerned, ticked up a bit. "She should know better than to go far into strange territory. Maybe I should go look for her." Earl Wolf stood and stretched. His old aches and pains seemed to have mostly faded with the approach of spring. He was an old wolf, but a healthy one. Even the knees, he decided. "I'll go. I gave her permission. If she circles back here first, we'll have her trapped and teach her a lesson about making her elders worry for her." Lacy huffed, and he was about to turn away to plunge into the verge. She grasped his arm. "Be careful, Father. There are too many two-legs in this area." They stepped towards one another and briefly embraced. It was not a typical mannerism to show affection among either of their current species, yet their bond went back to when they were both other types of beings, when an older man had cuddled his sweet shelter puppy. As they parted, he gape-grinned and loped away like a youngster, hot on the trail, which indeed he was, at least as far as being hot on the trail was concerned. Adele's scent was recent, and she had no reason to be overly cautious, so she was easy to follow. He surged along, halting briefly for quick checks of the ground to make sure he maintained the right direction. She had gone farther along a straight trail to the north than he would have allowed had he known. He got another scent and realized that she followed another trail, that of a possum that had passed that way the previous night. "Oh, that girl dearly loves possum. She'll follow it for miles if need be," he laughed. Shortly the trail widened into something else, a path made by larger creatures than possums. There was a smell of deer and hogs and humans. He rushed ahead. Concern now filled his heart. The human scent was older than the others, but still fresh enough to indicate that he had been here in the past 2 or 3 days. He rushed along the trail, catching Adele's scent and even a track or two where mud still lingered from the recent melt. He caught a new scent, enticing but mingled with strange odors. Technology. Metal. The structures ahead was all but invisible, even in the bright, late afternoon light. The odor of fresh meat emanated from it, but only faintly, as though it had been recently present, but then removed. He sniffed the air, circled to make sure that the structure was fully upwind, and took another sniff and a good hard listen. He heard muffled sounds, and from within the structure it must have been heavily insulated. He could hear calls and howls. Adele. He realized that the structure was some kind of elaborate, high-tech trap, and his granddaughter was inside. He rushed forward, sure that with the trap sprung, there was no danger. He called out to the young dog woman, "Adele, Grandpa's here. I will set you free." He could barely make out her reply. "Grandpa, run!" He paused and stood still, puzzled. Why would she want him to flee? He could smell no danger, just a chemical odor that rose from the ground near the base of the structure. He couldn't quite identify the smell. Then he felt sharp spikes enter the top of his shoulders from above. He looked up and noted a small aircraft that hovered almost silently above the trees. A drone. Should have heard it. Distracted. Was his last rueful thought. Charlie stood over the crumpled form of the very large werewolf, one of the biggest he'd seen. "Hey, Don, what do you suppose this is doing? Sure to make some weird noises before the drone tapped it." Don shrugged. "Who knows why monsters do what they do? I'm just glad we're already on the way here for the young'un. Dr. Z's gonna like her." He paused. "Maybe he was hunting her. You know, these two types don't get along. We'll probably saved her life." "I doubt she'll be grateful, though." Charlie shrugged in turn. Z-Squad should have done getting her ready for transport. Should maybe get them to move the trap. The critters don't seem to come back to the same ones in the same place. Can't fool them twice. They went about their duties, and the unconscious forms of Adele and Earl Wolf were soon en route to the place of pain and hiding, the facility. Lacy, Oscar, and Earl, too, followed the trail more cautiously and slowly when they caught the blend of smells that included the objects of their search. It was well past dark, but they could see quite well. There was no unusual sounds, but the ground had been disturbed, and the strong scent of many two-legs filled the air and almost masked those of Adele and Grandpa Wolf. They had clearly been caught, maybe even slain by two-legs. "Impossible," Lacy spat. Oscar looked over at her, and then Earl too, then back at his wife. "I could never imagine such a thing, but when I was still a canine, I witnessed many things that I didn't understand. I remember, but I still don't comprehend it all. However, they had things, machines and other items that could do amazing things. There were numerous of them here. I don't know how they kept their presence masked." He caught a whiff of something he'd recalled from his early days, from a large animal call to which he and his handlers had been dispatched. He hissed at the others, "Run!" They instantly complied. None of them followed the exact trail by which they'd approached, lest something was creeping along in their wake. About half a mile from the place where the trap had been laid, they halted, scanned the area, froze, scouted it, then returned to gather and speak in hushed tones. There was a smell. It was a substance that caused sleep in large animals, Oscar warned. It was faint, but there had been much of it earlier. I think that's how they were caught. Lacy agreed. I smelled it, but I didn't know what it was. If it is used to capture, then perhaps they are not dead? There was no odor of fresh blood. At least not theirs, Earl too added. They spoke of their observations for a while, and finally Lacy called a halt. They've taken our pack mates. We will hunt the hunters. We must be cautious. If they can trap those two, they can trap any of us. They may be why the skunk ape was so scared and may account for why Pete's pack has gone missing. We'll stay together at all times. We'll find and rescue our Adele and Grandpa Wolf. or we will wreak vengeance on those who have harmed them." In defiance of their own safety, they set up a howling that was filled with grief, longing, and anger. So quoth this raven,
"Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you."